Today we're going to talk about some of the most important mechanisms keeping us alive. We are talking about the circulatory system. So if you look to the right, I've got a diagram of both our circulations, and it looks really complicated, but we're going to break it down and hopefully make it a little bit simpler. So like I just said, we have two circulations. One of them is called the pulmonary circulation. This goes to your lungs so that your blood can go and collect oxygen. The other one is called the systemic circulation, and this one goes out to your entire body. And in the middle of it all is our pump, the heart. So the circulatory system has got a few different types of blood vessels. There's arteries, which carry blood away from the heart, so artery away. There's veins that carry blood back to the heart, and there's capillaries that are these really little tiny vessels that actually feed your cells. So this is all going to be facilitated by the heart. And in the heart, we've got some anatomy to remember. These top little parts are called the atria. So this is an atrium and that's an atrium. And the bottom two are called ventricles. And they're going to be separated. This whole part is separated by a lot of valves. And the function of these valves is to prevent backflow. So blood can get through here, but it tries to come back, and the valve is like, nope, not today, not ever. So when blood first enters the heart, coming back from your body, it's going to come back into these two vessels called the vena cava. And it's going to go into the right atrium. So the right side of the heart, this is backwards because you're looking at the patient. So this is the patient's right. That's how we do everything in anatomy. The whole right side of the heart is going to have deoxygenated blood because we have not gone to the lungs yet. We just came back from the body. The blood is exhausted. It's depleted all of its oxygen stores. So this blood is going to go through the right atrium, through the right ventricle, and it's going to go out toward the lungs. So if we look back at this diagram, we've done this, and now we're going to go into the lungs. So here and there. And these vessels are weird because they're blue, which means deoxygenated, but they are arteries. So most of the time, arteries have oxygenated blood and veins have deoxygenated blood, but the lungs are the pulmonary circulation is one of two exceptions, the other being the umbilical artery and vein that have to do with pregnancy in the fetus. But anyways, so this deoxygenated blood is going to make its way into the lungs, and at the lungs, when you breathe in, go and watch my respiratory system video if you haven't. There are these little sacs at the end of your lungs called alveoli, and they're covered in capillaries, and these are pulmonary capillaries. So that's all these right here are going to be surrounding every single alveolus, and there's a lot of them. So we're going to get a lot of oxygen. It's all going to load onto hemoglobin, and we're going to take that oxygen with our blood back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, and those veins are red because they are oxygenated because we just got all this oxygen from the lungs. Now we're going to enter the left side of the heart, go through the left atrium and the left ventricle. And the left ventricle is like this big muscular thing because it doesn't have to just pump blood to the lungs, which are like right next door. It has to pump all the blood out to the entire body, which is a big task. So the ventricle is very muscular, the left ventricle, and it's going to pump all this blood out to the body through this big artery called the aorta. And that's how our blood circulates through our body. And I know I went through that kind of fast. If you want another review, I have another video with just the path of blood flow through the heart. And I'm using my cool little heart model in that video, so I would highly recommend. But let's talk for a minute about how the heart knows when to beat. And this is going to have to do with electrical signals produced by the heart's own cells. So it works kind of like an action potential with the neurons, in that it works by ion flow and electricity. You don't have to know the details of it, but you might want to know the order that these impulses go in. So this is like the characteristic little wave that you see when you're looking at somebody's heartbeat. And we're going to break it down into sections based on what parts of the heart are doing the signaling. So the signal starts at the sinoatrial node, or SA node. It's going to travel to the AV node, or atrioventricular node, where it gets kind of delayed. Then it's going to go to something called the bundle of His, and from the bundle of His, it goes through those fibers of that bundle into something called the Purkinje fibers. So you might want to know this order. So let's take a closer look at these arteries, veins, and capillaries and see their similarities and their differences. So on all of these, we're going to have a layer of cells inside called the endothelium. And then with arteries and veins, not as much with capillaries, because the job of capillaries is to diffuse nutrients and oxygen directly to the cells. So we don't want as much stuff in the way impeding that process. But for arteries and veins, we're going to also have a layer of smooth muscle. And then there's going to be connective tissue on the outside that helps it stay in touch with all the other areas of the body it's supposed to be, so it doesn't move around. But arteries are going to have to be a lot more elastic than veins, and the reason why is because they have a lot to do with regulating blood pressure and regulating where the blood goes. So the arteries can do something called vasoconstriction, which is constricting, and vasodilation, which is dilating. And for this, they need an extra thick layer of smooth muscle, so thicker than veins. And they're going to do these things based on hormonal control. So there's a couple different substances that can control whether these arteries dilate or constrict. The major vasodilator that you probably have to know is called nitric oxide, or NO. There's also something called endothelin, and endothelin is a peptide that can constrict arteries. And arteries will constrict when blood pressure needs to be heightened. They're also going to constrict when they need to divert blood away from certain areas. So say that a lion is chasing me. It's going to activate this thing called the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response. And my body's going to go, you don't need your digestive system right now. You need your brain and you need your heart to beat really fast. And so my blood vessels in my digestive system and maybe like also in my skin are going to constrict so that blood doesn't get there as much. And then blood vessels in the areas where I need it, like my skeletal muscle and my heart and my brain, are all going to dilate. So that's something arteries can do. It also has to do with thermoregulation. So say I'm really cold, the blood vessels in my skin are going to constrict. So that's arteries. When we're looking at veins, the difference with veins is that they don't have the power of the heart behind them as much. So the blood needs some extra mechanisms to be able to get where it needs to get. And this is going to be twofold. One of these is going to be that veins are controlled by skeletal muscle. So there's skeletal muscle like all over your body in like every place you can move voluntarily. And the veins in those places, when your skeletal muscle contracts, because it is, you're going to move around throughout the day, the veins are going to squeeze their blood, and it's going to go only one direction because of the second part of this mechanism, which is valves. And we talked a bit about valves when we saw the heart, and we said that it'll make blood flow unidirectionally because blood can push on one end of the valve and the valve will open, but if it goes the other way, the valve will slap shut. And last but definitely not least, let's look at capillaries. So there's a nice little histological representation of capillaries here. So you can see all the little red blood cells in here that are carrying hemoglobin. And here is the tissue right next to the capillary, and you can see that the capillary wall is not very thick at all, and that's because these nutrients that the blood is carrying and the oxygen the blood is carrying have to diffuse across here. So these cells are lacking in those things, which means to get from high concentration to low concentration, glucose and oxygen and anything else the cells may need, they're going to go this way, toward the cells. The other thing that's going to happen with the capillaries is that any waste in your cells, that's in high concentration in your cells and low concentration in your blood, so that's going to go the other way. So waste is going to go this way. And that's how we get out waste, and that waste is eventually going to end up getting filtered out in the kidney. So if we look at a comparison of arteries and veins and capillaries, so this is arteries, this is capillaries, this is veins, right? We're going to look at a few things in them, and one of the things I want to look at is cross-sectional area. So the more capillaries, the more vessels that you have, the more cross-sectional area there's going to be. So in the capillaries, what happens is you branch off so many times that you get an increased area of all these blood vessels. Like if we were going to take all these capillaries and like bundle them together, the area of that would be bigger than the area of arteries or the area of veins. And this is because we have so many cells that we have to reach. We can also look at the speed of blood, and we're looking at the linear speed. So if this is my vessel, I'm looking at, like, say, how many meters per second the blood is moving this way. I'm not looking at volume per second. So you know how I said that capillaries have a greater cross-sectional area? Well, if you do the math out, it turns out that this means that their linear speed, the linear speed of blood in the capillaries is going to be the least. So blood flow is slowest in the capillaries. There's also the highest resistance in the capillaries. Blood flow is going to be faster in the arteries because they're closer to the heart. That makes sense, right? Because they're closer to the source of all the pumping and all the power. So they're the fastest. And then the speed of blood in veins is the middle of both of those speeds. Then we can look at pressure, and pressure is going to be higher in the arteries because, again, they're closer to the heart. And it's going to be lowest in the veins. But what's all this zigzagging going on here? And what the heck is systolic and diastolic? Well, let's find out. Remember how we looked at the heart, and it has atria, and it has ventricles. Well, if we're looking at the cycle of the heart beating, both the atria contract at the same time, and then later on, both the ventricles contract. And when both the ventricles are contracted, you can imagine that the pressure of this whole system is at its highest, because you got less volume, right? And then, if the ventricles are relaxed, the pressure is going to be a little lower. So when the ventricles are contracted, we call that systole. When they're relaxed, we call that diastole. And that gets us two pressure numbers. So if you ever see like somebody's blood pressure is like 120/80 or something, this is systolic, and this would be diastolic. So diastolic is always that lower number. Usually we're more concerned with systolic blood pressure. So systolic blood pressure in an adult is normally 90 to 140 millimeters of mercury. Millimeters of mercury is a pressure unit. And if it gets too low, that could signal to us that like the heart's not working right, or you don't have enough volume. So like if you're dehydrated, your blood pressure can be low. I said the bottom number wasn't important, but I mean, sometimes the relationship between them is. So for example, narrowing blood pressure is one of the signs in Beck's triad, which is symptoms for cardiac tamponade, or widening blood pressure can be a sign of traumatic brain injury and something called the Cushing triad. Not going to get too much into that, but there's a lot of fun clinical stuff with blood pressure. Anyways, so that's blood pressure, but now we're going to talk about a third component. So we talked about the pump, which is the heart. We talked about the container of this system, which is the vessels. Now I want to talk about the fluid that actually goes through your arteries and capillaries and veins. So if you take blood and you spin it down through a centrifuge, the stuff that's the heaviest is going to be cells. And this is going to be specifically red blood cells, or erythrocytes are going to make up a good percentage of the blood. So that's this stuff. And these blood cells are unique in that they don't have a nucleus. They don't actually have any organelles. So red blood cells are basically just big pouches of membrane that have hemoglobin and ions and proteins and stuff, but they don't really have much else going on. They survive solely on glycolysis for their ATP. So if you get questions about like the electron transport chain or the Krebs cycle, red blood cells are never the right answer, because all that happens in the mitochondria, right? The other kind of cells that are in the blood are white blood cells, or leukocytes, and those will be part of the immune system. And I have a whole video on the immune system, so definitely check that out. Actually, I have two, because it's too amazing to include in only one. There are some other components of your blood, and these are all kind of lumped into one category. We call that plasma. So that's like the more liquidy part of blood. And in this, you'll have water, the solvent, of course, and then you'll have some ions, so like sodium, potassium, etc. Then you'll have proteins. One really important one in the blood is called albumin, and albumin is important for osmolarity, which is like the concentration of solutes in your blood. And let's see, what else do we have? There's also clotting factors, and there are going to be some other things like for lipid transport and stuff, but we're not too worried about that. So let's look briefly about how these blood cells come to be, and this is going to be through something called hematopoiesis. This occurs in the bone marrow. Throughout development of an embryo and a fetus, it's going to occur in other places because we don't have bones in the beginning. That's all going to be in my immune system part 2 video. So if you want to learn more about hematopoiesis, check that one out. So I'm going to kind of skip this a bit for now. And then before we end, I want to go quickly over the lymphatic system. And to understand the lymphatic system, you have to understand some forces that go on in blood exchange in the capillaries. So the capillaries are always going to have an arterial side. So we came from an artery, right? And a venous side. So this is going to drain out into veins. And the stuff on the outside, so all the cells that are getting fed by these capillaries, so here's some cells. This is not the endothelium. This is other cells that these capillaries are feeding. We call this the interstitium. So actually this isn't like the inside of the cells, but this is like the gaps between them, the extracellular matrix, all the stuff that that these cells are floating in. So we've talked a lot about the pressure in the arteries and how high it is. And the pressure that we've been talking about is specifically something called hydrostatic pressure. So there is high hydrostatic pressure in these arteries, and that just means that there's a lot of fluid in them, and that fluid is being pushed out at a high pressure onto the arterial walls. Whereas in the interstitium, we don't really have this. We have low hydrostatic pressure because there's no heart pumping on the interstitium. So this pressure creates a gradient, and whenever we have a pressure gradient, we always want to go from high pressure to low pressure. So hydrostatic pressure is going to push fluid this way. On the other side of things, now we've fed our cells a bunch, and there's a little more fluid in the interstitium because we pushed a lot of fluid out of the vein, or out of the vessel, because we pushed it out while it was in the capillary. But anyway, so now we have high hydrostatic pressure here because we just pushed out a bunch of fluid, and that fluid left the blood vessel, so now the blood vessel has low hydrostatic pressure. This is going to make fluid move this way because we want to go from high pressure to low pressure. There's also something called osmotic pressure, and osmotic pressure is kind of backwards. This whole osmolarity thing is kind of backwards if you ask me, but osmolarity is the concentration of solutes. So to start out with, the blood has got a lot of fluid, right? So its solute concentration is going to be a bit lower. So blood is going to have a lower osmolarity. Meanwhile, the interstitium has made a lot of waste, has not got a lot of blood yet, so it's going to have high osmolarity. This means that the interstitium is going to have high osmotic pressure. And what this means is that the interstitium is going to want to suck things in, suck fluid in specifically, in order to dissolve all of its solutes. So the blood has low osmotic pressure, and the interstitium has high osmotic pressure. And I told you this osmolarity thing is backwards. This is going to make fluid want to flow from low osmotic pressure to high osmotic pressure, because osmotic pressure is like a sucking in force. So it's going to suck all this fluid into the interstitium that has a lot of solutes. On the other side of things, on the venous side, now we've sucked a bunch of fluid into the interstitium. So it doesn't have as high osmolarity anymore, because if we add more volume of like mainly just fluid, then there's not as much of a concentration, or there's not as high of a concentration. So all of a sudden we have low osmotic pressure here. And then in the blood, because we just dumped out a bunch of fluid, but a lot of stuff doesn't go through, like proteins like albumin, red blood cells, stuff like that, that's all going to stay in the blood. So now we have high solutes and not as much fluid, and this is going to mean that the blood has high osmotic pressure. So this wants to suck things in. And like we said, osmotic pressure means that fluid goes from low to high osmotic pressure. And this is going to make things go this way, like they're supposed to. Osmotic pressure, you might also hear it called oncotic pressure. I don't know why that is. You think onco, you want to think cancer. Has nothing to do with cancer. So oncotic pressure, osmotic pressure, same thing. So these are the forces that are controlling where fluid goes, whether it goes into the blood or out of the blood. So this whole arterial thing is going to push lots of fluid into the interstitium. This venous thing that we have going on here with the fluid going back into the vein, it's going to do a little bit, but not as much. So the point of this is that we get a net loss of fluid from the blood going into the interstitium. Now, we don't want a bloated interstitium, and we don't want to run out of fluid in our blood, because like we talked about, if we get too little fluid, we don't get high enough blood pressure, and then we have problems. So how do we fix this? We fix this with a system called the lymphatic system, and lymphatic system is going to have kind of unidirectional vessels. So they're going to have this blunt, dead end, and fluid can go through these lymphatic vessels, and these lymphatic vessels are eventually going to drain back into the blood, but not before everything gets filtered. So all this fluid that now that it's in the lymphatic vessels, we call it lymph, is going to get filtered in the lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes aren't like one big set of organs. There's like lots and lots and lots of tiny little lymph nodes all throughout your body. So all the lymph is going to go through the lymph nodes before it gets back to the blood. And in these lymph nodes, you're going to have a bunch of immune cells, and these immune cells are going to filter out and recognize any pathogens that may have made their way into the tissue. And there's more on that also in the immune system video. So that's why we need a lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is also important in transporting lipids that are broken down by the digestive system. So that is everything you need to know about circulation.